Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Baldrige Foundation's Institute for Performance Excellence webinar, Stop Visualizing and Start Utilizing, Making Data Work. I'd like to take a moment to recognize members of the Mac Baldrige Society who serve as the trustees of the Foundation's Institute for Performance Excellence. It is their generous support that makes presentations like today's possible. Here's today's agenda. Our guest presenter is Paul Campbell, Executive Vice President, Competitive Solutions. And now I will turn it over to Paul to get us started.
Jerry, thank you very much. And I appreciate the opportunity and welcome the opportunity to present to the Baldrige members. As Jerry said, my name is Paul Campbell. I'm Executive Vice President and CTO at Competitive Solutions. And the opportunity for today is really to talk about visualizing data and how do you look at that data and really start to begin to use that data for use and work. And what we found over probably the last number of years, and especially probably as you think about COVID, what COVID's implications to a lot of organizations, there's a lot of leadership fatigue that has happened in many organizations. But it's not just leadership fatigue. I think there's a sense of data fatigue as well that's occurring in many organizations. And why I say that is with technology and changes that happen in technology, there's an acceleration in adoption. You think about artificial intelligence and capabilities that exist. There's just so much data that is readily available to organizations today. They really don't know what to do about it, and they struggle with that information. Hopefully today, I'll give you a sense of what you should begin to think about. So it's not, again, not about visualizing the information. It's really how do you utilize effectively that data. So when you think about a lot of IQ or EQ, and you hear these terms out in the marketplace today, and I'm sure a lot of you have thought about this, is, IQ, right? It's how you use information. It's really about articulation of what metrics matter. It's like, what are you measuring? What's the data? What are we really talking about as an organization? When you talk about EQ, it's why should people care about the information? Why should people care about the metrics that they're measuring in their businesses? Why should they care about the actions and the information that they're sharing across their organizations? But one of the things that we've begun to find in organizations is there's a missing element that exists, which is what we call process intelligence. And it really is the articulation of how the information is used effectively in their organizations. And there's a gap there. IQ, great, many organizations, many people are adopting that process. EQ, obviously, a lot of attention was focused in the last 5-10 years in terms of organizations and the growth of their leaders. Process excellence is really an evolving area about looking at your data, looking at the visualization of that data, and beginning to use effectively that data within your organization. And that's truly how we look at a high functioning leader. It's the combination of all three elements. And that's really what we're going to talk about throughout this entire webinar today. But before I get into that, let me just take a step back and share with you a little bit about Competitive Solutions. We're a company that was founded in 91, so 32 years ago, 33 years ago, headquartered in Raleigh, North Carolina, with an office in Atlanta, Georgia. We're started as a consulting company, migrated into a software company. We've written a number of books like many other organizations have done. But the bigger part is we deal with a lot of organizations across a lot of different vertical markets, whether it be manufacturing, whether it be the public sector, governmental agencies out there. It's a lot of rich content that we get from these organizations because the behavior, how they look at information, how they work, while you would think it's different, truly it's not different in terms of the information that they're really trying to accomplish and what they're trying to drive towards their business. So this is just a sample of some of the customers: 3M, Abbott, Pfizer, Zoetis, some big names you're going to recognize if you use a lot of the products that are out there. Rust-Oleum, people go to Home Depot right out there. great customers, continue to use them, long-term customers. There's a series of products that we also offer, process-based leadership, Visual, and leadership GPS. And I'll talk about those a little bit later in the webinar. But let's kind of get into it. So if you think about kind of IQ, it's that intelligence component, right? It's how do we really look at the data? How do we really interpret the information that's being presented to us? And again, as I said, there's a lot of different sources of information that are readily available today that organizations can tap into. And in many cases, it's just purely overwhelming to the organizations. So if you think about kind of the metrics, right, and information, whether it's a KPI that you define or it's a metric you're looking at out there, really it's what are the numbers kind of telling you? And the information is about education. It's about how that information is going to help my organization understand where I am today and where I'm moving to in the future. So as you go through kind of, what do these numbers mean, right? So what does numbers mean? What is it telling me as a leader in the organization? Am I looking at a pretty chart? Am I looking at a pretty graph that says a little trend out there that's showing me the metric information is improving, or my data is improving, or it's going the wrong direction, like revenue or production numbers as an example? And then what's the interpretation of that? And why? What are the reasons why those are changing? The metrics understood. This is a big challenge across many organizations for the simple fact that when organizations develop KPIs or metrics, there's a high tendency for this information to be driven in a silo. And when they look at the information, they're looking at the data potentially based upon information that may be calculated differently across different parts of the organization. So how do you really understand that, right? How do you figure out if one team measures the same metric differently than another team? You can't. So alignment becomes a key factor on what you do in the system. So it's a kind of a characteristic of IQ, is education, understanding that. But it really kind of distills down to one critical factor. Are we winning or losing? Whether it's all this data that we're measuring in here, are the teams aligned and understand what they're doing? All that is great, but it really comes down to, is the team and does the team understand, are they winning or losing? Simple fact, right? That's all they need to understand. And how are they winning or losing in comparison to the overall organization in the system? And the last point here is about embedding it into the onboarding process. This is probably a failure in 90% of the organizations that we work with today. And it really comes down to when the hiring process and the churn has happened, and especially within the last number of years, there's been a higher level of churn that's occurred within organizations for a number of different factors out there. They don't spend the time educating the new incoming staff, whether it be someone transferring into or a new employee that's coming from the outside of the organization, educating them on understanding what is it we're trying to accomplish as a team. Typically what happens is I'm thrown into my job. The expectation is I'm going to start working. There's very little training that happens, very little indoctrination that's going to occur within my role. Spend the time. So that's kind of one of the things that we highly encourage you, spending the time. And again, we'll talk about each of these as we go through this. So the second characteristic is the kind of the EQ, emotional intelligence, right? That's really about motivating and inspiring the organization, right? Everyone wants to feel good about their jobs. They want to feel good about what they're delivering to the organization. They want to feel good about how they're contributing success to the organization out there. So it comes down to really teaching organizations, like, why should I care? Why should I care about the data? And again, going back to kind of the metrics out here, this is, another big failing that we see in many organizations out there is the engagement that you find when you're building these KPIs or these metrics is not at the team level or the staff level. So they're engaged in the process and they understand what you're trying to accomplish. Typically, it's a pass down. The senior leadership team has decided on what they're going to measure, and the expectation is everyone's going to begin to measure the information regardless of understanding or engagement of that information. Verse, kind of the contrary approach to that is the engagement component of it, right? Helping people understand and become engaged and participate in, right? That whole process of developing metrics. Celebrating the wins and driving accountability for the losses. You think about celebration. How often do we take a step back in the organization and really celebrate the successes that have happened? It's all about charge forward, charge forward, charge forward, not take a step back and really celebrate what happens. It's important. It's the feel good component that makes staff really feel engaged and connected to the business out there. But you also have to make people accountable, right? If the results are not achieving success or the desired results out there, what are we doing about it and how are we holding people accountable for the results, right? It's not just glossing over the information, okay, we'll address that next time. It's really holding people and their feet to the fire in terms of accountability. And kind of the last point in this EQ component is the model, the collaborative problem solving. It's really the team, right? The team understanding how can they problem solve, how can they move the business forward collectively as an organization. While individuals may have components and pieces of that role out there, it really is the team's responsibility to move forward out this. And you have to understand that. And you have to kind of engage the teams around that component. But the EQ is certainly a critical component, but PQ becomes really the glue, right? That's kind of the piece that's been missing all along, we believe, from a lot of organizations, that glues the IQ and the EQ together and really creates that high functioning leader out there. And it's just, think about it as it's a process mindset. It's really, I'm going to continue to do this process effectively, consistently, across the board, day in and day out, regardless of who sits in that chair as a leader. And that really is kind of an important point, is it's not the leader, right? We're not dealing with the personality of the leader that may be driving my business forward, or the proximity of that leader to the team that's ensuring that that team is actively working out there. It's those 3 or 4 processes that are out there. And what we think about is really 4 processes. It's the business acumen, which is really the scorecard. It's the metrics, right? It's defining what are those critical few things that need to be measured within the organization, within each teams. The execution process is, how do we use that data? So kind of really what we're touching on in this webinar is, how do we use that information effectively, the accountability component. But equally as important is communication. One of the things that may be great is we can track a lot of data, we can hold people accountable, but if we're not effectively communicating the information across the organization or even within the teams, a lot of it's lost out there. So an effective communication process is critical. And then modeling ideal behaviors, right? What are the expectations for the team? That's important. That's what we want to see. And it really promotes that sustainability by driving a process within an organization and a mindset of that process. You create a sustainable foundation that an organization can move forward with, again, regardless of who the leader is that's in that role. So we're talking about data, we're looking at utilization of data, and it's not about the data out there. It really isn't about the data. It's really about the system of use. And this is kind of how we look at the system of use. And as we just kind of touched on a second ago, is we look at it in those 3 categories: the business acumen, the scorecard, the execution process, and the communication process, with the ultimate goal driving connectivity, right? Connecting the organization to the information, connecting the organization to the success of the business. The clarity is understanding, right? Understanding what I'm trying to measure within the organization, understanding how the information I'm measuring affects other parts of the organization, how the information affects the overall success of the business. And consistency is the process, right? Making sure that, again, regardless of who's the leader of the team, who's the leader of the organization, this continues. This is sustainable, right? As an organization. So when you think about the business acumen, the setting of the foundation is really, organizations or teams, you can't work in vacuums. One of the things we highly encourage, whether it's a entire organization or it's an individual team that's out there, to bring teams together when defining measures. So whether measure be defined as a KPI or a metric out there, bring them together and have them participate in the process of building what you're going to measure. There may be specific things that the leadership team communicates that are what we call non-negotiables, that are must-haves out there, but the team should have the freedom and the flexibility to say, okay, I understand what we're trying to ultimately achieve. What is my strategic vision? What's my mission that I'm after? Here are the things that I need to do to help achieve those successes. And by engaging the teams in this process, we've really found a significant change in terms of trust and ownership in leadership, right? Because they brought their individuals into the process. They've invited them. They've helped them participate in there. And these silos, right? You want to break down these silos. You socialize and you align measures across the organization. Well, you know what? What we find across many organizations is they may build some wonderful metrics that they're really going to measure out there. The problem is they haven't sat down with the 3 or 4 or 5 other teams that may be dependent upon their services. They may be a feeder into the services that are being performed by this team. And by not aligning the information, you've now created these silos again, right? Because you're not consistent, you're not driving in one direction, and you want to break those silos down. So what does it come down to in terms of what you're looking for? It really comes down to low functioning teams and high functioning teams, and kind of what we look at. The low functioning teams, it's all about visualization, right? I'm going to create these pretty graphs, these pretty charts. I'm going to take a look at them, maybe weekly, maybe monthly out here. Not sure what it really tells me. It could be scatter diagrams, just lots of data plots out there, but is it really telling me anything? It could also be a thermometer out there. It's kind of a point in time measurement versus the contrary, right? Which is what you want to get to in the organization, which is the high functioning, which is really what you drive towards in the business acumen process, which is really utilization. It's utilizing the data, right? Putting the information in use across the organization, whether it be I'm looking at the data on a regular frequency, I'm talking about the data on a regular frequency, I'm holding people accountable to the results as well. That's really what you're after. But also, as part of that, you're using information as a thermostatic approach, right? So think about the differences between a thermometer and a thermostat, right? What's the difference? A thermometer is going to be a point in time measure. A thermostat is going to be a point in time measure, but it's going to adjust, right? If I want to have temperature in my home at 68 degrees, it's going to go up and down based upon the temperature of the outside and how it's influencing the inside of my home, as an example. It's really the same thing for your business. It's adjustment to how you're performing in the organization, and that's the continued adjustment to the organization. So when you think about kind of a management system out there, a lot of organizations, there's different ways to look at it. This is just one way to look at it within organization. What we'll call it a tiered system, a tier 1 through tier 8, where typically a tier 8 may be senior leadership versus a tier 1 is going to be in the manufacturing world, could be on the floor, could be a shift operator as an example out there. And there's different behaviors that exist across this, but the process is still the same in terms of how you're looking at it, right? So if you look at a tier one, a shift operator, typically it's going to be a low tech kind of approach, right? They may have a daily management system, a visual board, a whiteboard that's on the floor. They're just marking off very quickly because the idea is let them do their jobs without having to really focus on putting information into a system or recording information somewhere else. But as you kind of go up the chain and up the organization, you now get into how do we look at that information? How do we transform that information so I can look at the data across a leadership level and allow myself to look at not only how I'm holistically performing as an organization, but also what are the what are the lead ups to the performance in here? And can I explore the information? And can I look at the information out there? All this is tied together, right? There's no disjointed approach that exists here. And each of these components that we're talking about here are also having that conversation on a regular basis, whether it be daily startup meetings, or it could be weekly performance meetings, or it could be monthly strategic conversations that are out there. All of these teams are talking about the information on a regular basis, and they're consistent on how they're talking about the data. That really becomes your thermostatic approach out here. So low tech to a high tech approach, whatever it may be in there. But the idea is looking at the data, utilizing the data to be more effective. So really kind of the business acumen kind of ultimately looks at really these three components. So first, like we talked about before, kind of look at the IQ component, educating, right? What matters most in here? It's that identification of those critical business needs. And that's kind of a key point in this, because I can't tell you how many times that we've looked at scorecards that may be 100, 200, 300 metrics long. And I'll tell you, in a conversation with any of those teams, they cannot effectively have any true conversations because it's just too much data to looking at. They don't understand what the focus is, where to focus the energy and resources, and what are those critical business view that truly are going to impact the performance of their business. So you kind of have to take a step back when you're looking at this and really take a hard look at what are those things that truly influence my business. And again, engaging the team as part of that process, you'll be surprised, really changes the dynamics of this discussion, because there's a lot of rich history, a lot of rich knowledge that a lot of your staff can bring into the conversation that's not leveraged when these metrics are developed. Leverage it, because they're gonna challenge this whole process that we need to think about these things. How do we create what we call leading indicators, those that are going to identify what may happen in the future without a change that's happening? So give me understanding of where the business is going and an opportunity to make changes before the business is moved in the wrong direction. And these are just some examples of critical areas like safety or quality or cost or people. And again, these are consistent across any kind of vertical market that exists. Most organizations, safety is a key concern, or quality, whatever quality is, cost, right? Financial numbers, people out there, always key items that we're looking at. But again, it goes down to that winning or losing, kind of are we winning or losing? So that's the education component out there. The facilitation is, the scorecards as part of your meetings. And again, going back to how teams behave today, is a lot of people go into meetings and there's nothing displayed. There's no agenda for my meetings. I'm not sure why I'm part of the meeting. I may have an idea why I'm joining this meeting. Change that, right? Change that dynamic out there. Have a business scorecard displayed prominently when I walk into a room. That's the primary driver of the agenda. This is going to change the dynamics of the conversation. The performance is red or green, right? It's very clear. Am I winning or am I losing? And the team understands this, but in terms of the metrics, and it's visual. So if you think about it, any of you, that you walk into a room and there's a scorecard that's displayed, it's showing the critical few metrics that I'm measuring, and each of these are showing the color red or green. If my scorecard is all red, I have an indication of how this conversation is going to go in the meeting. If it's all green, it's probably a different kind of conversation that's going to go. It really changes the excuse me, the dynamics of the discussions, but also focuses that conversation as well. And the motivation component, right? If you're using something, using data, and we'll talk about the action register in a moment out there, you're really looking at what are we doing about those things that are not achieving goal. So in these reviews that you do, whether it's daily or it's weekly and scorecards, it's not about green items unless it's a review. It's about red, right? It's about those things that are underperforming. What are we doing about underperforming metrics? Who's got that responsibility and accountability to do something about it? And let's watch it, right? Let's figure out where we're moving in the right direction. For the green items that may be existing more than 90 days, is there opportunity for a reevaluation or a review? It probably is, right? Can you further improve the target for the metric, right? Continuous improvement. Well, there's always opportunity for that conversation. Doesn't mean it's going to happen, but there's always an opportunity for that conversation. And it's something you should probably consider on a 90-day cycle out there for reevaluation, right? So this is kind of establishment of a business acumen process where you're creating the right metrics, you're only creating the critical few that you're going to measure, and using this information to help manage the business and motivate the business, right? Establishing a foundation on how I'm going to talk. The next step of that, right? So now I've got my scorecard created, I've got the information, I've got the metrics I'm going to measure. Now, what am I doing about the data, right? So it gets into what am I doing about the data? And this gets into really what we see in a lot of organizations, it's selective engagement, right? When you're sitting around a team, you're having a conversation, there may be 10 people around the table in that conversation, and only one or two people typically will raise their hands and say, I'll take that responsibility, I'll take ownership of that, and I'll do that, right? That's selective engagement, selective across the team, right? You're not engaging the entire team in that conversation in here. Accountability, right? It's often measured, okay, how people feel. And it's true, right? Many organizations don't track accountability. They don't hold their staff accountable to results out there. Okay, we're going to talk about it this week and we're going to have a conversation. And then we're going to talk about it next week and have the conversation. And then talk about it the following week and have the same conversation out there. Instead of truly representing this information in a way where it's going to make it visible and transparent that we're not delivering against what expectations are. And kind of going back to the first point is that selective engagement disparity of the biggest motivator of teams is, again, you've got high performance people that are raising their hands on a regular basis, or they're getting overwhelmed because I really depend upon a few individuals on my team and I don't feel as comfortable with other people on my team. Hopefully that's not the case, but it may be the case. And all that means is the high performers get overloaded with work out there and they become frustrated out there and become demotivated potentially. So you have to change that kind of dynamic in that game on what's going on. So really kind of think about this. Accountability should be visible, personal, and measurable. And really what I mean by that is when you're talking about an action or a corrective action plan, it should be very specific. Who is responsible? And it's not collective accountability across the team, not multiple people, it's an individual. When is the date that the person is committed to that corrective action to be completed? And where are we currently in this, and make it color coded as well. So if something's past due, it's red, just like a metric. It's either winning or losing in here, out there. It changes the narrative, because if I go into a meeting and I look at an action register, in addition to the scorecard, and an action register appears and my name appears on that action register, and I see 5 corrective actions that are all red, well, you know what? That's not a very good look, right? Out there. And I'm gonna have a lot of excuses why I haven't been able to achieve this. It's not about excuses anymore. It's what have you done to move the business forward out there? And you know what? If you can't get these things done, it's a different kind of conversation that you should be having as a team going forward. So really make this visible, personal, and measurable. Those are 3 key terms that I want you to take away from here. So think about kind of this component, right, in here, accountability, visualization. So this is that utilization component of the data. So it's about execution. It's all about execution. Metrics are being measured. When metrics are measured, if metric is underperforming, there should be a corrective action. And those 2 things should be tied together. They should be visible to all the team to see. Therefore, I can understand as a team, there's a metric that's red, and these are the things that are going on for this individual to improve upon the results for a future period. I'm not going to be dependent upon just a number of people. These metrics that I'm measuring should be assigned across the team, right? It shouldn't be focused or isolated just to individuals. It should be across the team. The red or underperforming metrics, like I'm talking about, documented corrective actions. But the other thing you want to do as part of this process is the actions are captured with 12-month clarity. So what I mean by that is when you write a corrective action, there's a tendency to write 1 or 2 words, a very short description of what we're trying to accomplish. The problem is a week from now, 2 weeks from now, when I go back to that, I may forget what I was actually trying to accomplish. Or a month from now, when someone else tries to look at it, they may not understand what the goal is. And especially the case when a lot of these actions are interrelated out there, you want to have something that's defined properly. What am I trying to achieve as part of this? And document that effectively. But the other part of this is making sure that if I own a corrective action and it's in jeopardy of being read for my meeting, I should be talking to my leaders. Right? I shouldn't wait to my meeting to actually have the conversation saying, okay, sorry, I didn't get to it. My action's read. I'll get to it next week. That's unacceptable in terms of behavior. What you want to instill in terms of a process is staff will come to their leaders in advance of the meeting, and you can set the frequency, whether it's 48 hours, which is what our recommendation is, or it's 72 hours, whatever that frequency is out there. And they renegotiate with their leader potentially a different due date. And what that does is it allows the leaders to have an opportunity to have the conversation dialogue with their staff saying, okay, I understand there's a problem. You're not going to finish this. Why? Number 1, is there too much workload for you? Is there not enough information? Is this action assigned to the wrong individual out there? So you have that conversation. Therefore, when you go into your meeting, you're having a very focused conversation. You're not going into the meeting with the free-for-all saying, okay, I didn't meet it, and let's now have a conversation on why it's red out there. Get away from those discussions, right? The engagement analysis component of it, you know, a lot of this data you're talking about in terms of utilizing the information now flows into an engagement analysis, right? I can look at how my staff are performing, and I should look at it every 90 days. If I'm looking at doing one-on-ones with my team members on a monthly basis, bring it up. It's a very objective way to look at the information about data and the utilization of that data, the corrective action component of that, and how that staff member is performing, right? How they're personally moving the business forward. So the final kind of component here is the communication. Again, this is really going back to the communication, the meetings component I was talking about before. It's about the communication, right? We can have these metrics we measure, we can have this data that we're capturing out there, we can establish corrective actions in a process we want to measure against, but we want to have an effective way we're talking about the information and a regular way we're talking about information. Today we hear a lot about meetings feel like an addition to work, right? How many of you on the webinar feel like you're joining meetings that, one, I don't need to be here, two, I have no contribution to these meetings, or I really don't know what it's about, right? Out there. That's a very, very common thing. And there's lots of statistics that are out there about leaders spending X% of their time in meetings, which is true. If you really talk to, and we've talked to a lot of organizations out there, it's meetings, right? I'm double booking meetings. It's not a good process, right? Let's just call meeting out there in here. Personalities also drive meetings in here. It's just not effective in terms of the process that you want to look at. So what does it really mean? What do you want to really translate into and transition into for the communications? So you really want to get into kind of, again, going back to the business acumen component, the thermostatic metrics, right? Power the meeting, right? The scorecards displayed prominently when I walk into the room sets the tone of the conversation, right? Right there in front of us, we know how the meeting is going to go. That's number one. A standardized agenda becomes critical in the conversation, right? This is what we're going to talk about. And this is key that you want to measure. You want people talking about the same thing the same way, right? You don't want one team having one agenda, another team having a certain different agenda, as an example. Standardized agendas across the teams. And one of the examples I'll give you all is we have a organization that's automotive space, and they came to us and they said, we're challenged with this out there. And what we did is they had 75 different teams that were using visual, our tool, and they wanted to standardize that process out there. So they created a standardized meeting across all 75 teams. And their expectation now is that each team, when they have a conversation, is going to talk the same way. I'm going to talk about the scorecard. I'm going to talk about the action register, and we'll talk about what that looks like in a second. But the meetings also have to remain focused, right? They have to provide timely feedback. So they're an enabler of work. This isn't where I want to regurgitate what my last week was or what my challenges are. This is about future focused enabler of work, right? That's really what meetings are designed or should be designed for going forward. So this is kind of an example of what a standardized agenda would look like, and what we work with is an action register. Scorecard, again, sets the stage when I walk in the room. The first thing I talk about, my action register. And this is just a review of the actions that we're due for this period, right? This should be a very, very quick conversation about those actions that had a due date on or before my current meeting cycle, right? I'm not getting into an action that's due 6 months from now. That's not relevant to this conversation right now. It's what was due right now. This should be a few minutes at most, 90 seconds, hopefully, in here. But it's also a way you can communicate to the team, okay, did people finish their work? Did people close their actions? So it's a way you can get alignment across the teams. The scorecard review, well, you've already set the stage because you already had the scorecard up when they walked into the room. Now it's really kind of delving into the scorecard, right? Let's talk about those red metrics that are on the scorecard. What are those corrective actions that have been put into a tool or being measured against that will tell us what we're doing to help improve that performance, that metric going forward? Around the table, people use this around the table as a way where I want to share with you how I've done the last week, right? Everything I've done the last week. And then the next person goes and they want to beat the person sitting to their right, right? as an example, right? Now it becomes one person did a minute, next person does 90 seconds, next person does 2 minutes, next person does 3 minutes, and your meetings go from an hour to 3 hours. And this is one of the biggest culprits of that is around the table. So here, what we encourage you to do is require that people put in, and there's extremes to this, require that people put in future focused around the table information. What is it I need from the team? What is it I want, right? So it's not problem solving, it's what is it I need from the team, and it's a conversation. It's very short, it's very focused in conversation. And here, I've seen kind of the extreme where if you have a tool in place where people, if they don't put kind of the messages and information I want to talk about and around the table into a tool prior to a meeting, that they don't have the right to speak during the meeting. That's a little extreme, in my opinion. But you know what? It gets the point across because it makes people think about what they want to share with the team prior to the meeting instead of going into the meeting, starting jotting out notes. Okay, well, I think about this, I need to think about this, I need to do this, and then sharing all this information. You know, recognition, like we said before, recognition, celebrate, right? Celebrate people. There's great ways you can do this. It's all about celebration. There's minor things we can celebrate. We can all celebrate something. Take the time to do this and let people know they're being celebrated. The pass up, pass down, this is really a way of communication. So it's what we call a team-to-team communication. It's really what we call an offensive positioning model where a senior leadership team is sharing critical information to the teams below them. And the expectation would be if I'm following standardized agenda, when the teams meet below me, they're going to talk about this pass down message. And then the last two here are the action review and meeting audit. The action review, the second one, really is important for meetings because what you're doing is you're capturing the things that were discussed during the meeting, whether it's an action or not. And if it's an action, you're discussing the action. You're also saying what the action is, who's responsible for the action, and what the target date is. Therefore, when the person walks out of the room, they've taken ownership of that item. You know, how many times that have you gotten actions or tasks assigned to you where you never even part of that meeting? Well, how much ownership do you really have if you're never part of that conversation in here? That's never the approach that you should be taking. These corrective actions that we're talking about, you're in a meeting. And if you can't join that meeting, you have a delegate that's participating for you and on your behalf out there that can take ownership and then communicate to you what's been assigned to you. It's a very different way to think about ownership across the organization and engagement as well. And an audit, right? An audit would be just talking about, did we move the business forward? It's not kind of this person talked about this. It's just about, did the meeting move the business forward and what are the opportunities that we can go for? But if you think about kind of an agenda and a kind of a sequence of events, right? Leadership team, they're going to talk on Monday, right? And then each tier below them will talk on a certain day the rest of the week. Therefore, when the leadership team does a pass down, each of the teams below them will be talking about that throughout the week and having that conversation. By the end of the week, all the teams should have gone through this, right? They should all understand, is the organization winning or losing? Is my team winning or losing? What are the critical pass down information from the leadership team that's been shared out there? Okay. So, you know, think about beyond data. You know, data is great, looking at information, looking at graphs, looking at charts, looking at KPIs. That's a great thing. But really take it beyond, and I encourage you to take it beyond that. Start looking at the iteration of the data. Start looking at the winning or losing mindset. Start looking at the execution process out there, the accountability component, which is key, and making that information visible and transparent, right? I don't want to separate, I don't want to have one place where I'm looking at a scorecard or dashboard in here, and I've got to go somewhere else to look at the actions that are being performed on here. There's no connectivity on that case. You want to have one place that shows the connectivity between all these components out there, because that helps with the engagement, that drives the engagement. It also drives the ideal behaviors that you're trying to accomplish within your organization. And last, on this is really encourage part of the onboarding process, whether it be identifying one individual that takes ownership of this, which is what we would encourage you to do on here. It's welcome to the team. This is how we do business. This is what our scorecard looks like. This is the process we follow out here. Indoctrinate the staff members into what you do and how you do it, so that they're not trying to figure it out themselves. They understand what you're trying to do and how you want to run the business. So this is just an example, and this is just a slide shows we offer Visuant. Visuant's think of it as a business performance tool. Process-based leadership is the foundation behind the tool that really drives the process we've been talking about throughout this webinar. And we have a leadership development program that really complements the whole process. But really for CSI, our company, we're all about optimizing people, process, and performance. That's really what it comes down to. And again, it's the data is component of it. The process is the bigger component of it, right? Establishing those standardized foundations that I'm going to behave on, that are sustainable and consistent across the organization, and getting that set first before we really begin to look at the data, right? Let the organization move in the right direction. So I thank you for your time. And now I think I'll open it for questions.
All right, thanks, Paul. We have a few questions here. The first one is, in setting the foundation as a staff person, how do we address a leader who is not motivated and not engaging? They say they are, but their actions say something else.
I mean, that's a great question. That's always a hard question, right, to answer, in terms of trying to be diplomatic and manage upwards to your leaders. That's really what you're talking about, is managing upwards to your leaders. It's helping them understand what are the benefits of this, right? And then holding it accountable to this. If you establish and you have a corrective action plan as an example, right? We're going to drive towards, this is what the team is moving towards for engagement perspective, right? I want to establish that and make someone accountable for this. The leader is going to push back, and we see it all the time out there. It's kind of a balancing act you have to work on. I don't think there's a simple answer to it, honestly, out there. It's how effective you really can manage upwards and help leaders understand the true benefits that they can get out of this, and really how it's going to help them, right? That's really what you want to get to, is how this is going to help them. And if you can get them to understand that, then it really becomes the win, right? Then they'll begin to adopt, okay, aha, it's an aha moment. And what I've seen in my career is, if you can help leaders understand something like this, a lot of times the leaders will adopt it as their own, and that's fine. It's not about who owns this, it's about getting the process in place. So my words of wisdom for you would be, carefully manage up and help them understand the benefits to them by establishing this foundational process.
Okay, the next question is, how do I know I have the right metrics?
Well, I guess really the question comes down to, one is your business, right? We can never tell you, and we never will tell you, do you have the right metrics, right? You can only answer that question yourselves, honestly, out there. But you have to look at, what is the ultimate goal? So let's use an example of, maybe the company is driving towards revenue growth, right? As an example, that's the overall objective of the company. How does my metric then apply to overall revenue growth of the company out there? You have to look at the metrics in a way where is that an influencer to that overall performance number that we're looking at? So as you build your metrics, there's a couple of things that I would say you do to determine this. One is, like I mentioned, I would engage your team in a conversation. So that's number one. Let them participate in the conversation to say, truly, what are the metrics that we should be measuring as a team? And I would say in almost every case that we've done this, there is very rich discussion by the team members to say yes or no across the metrics. Start there, and I think that will help you begin to understand what are truly the right metrics that you need to measure.
Paul, I'm going to combine these two. They kind of go together. Why are business intelligence tools better options than Excel, and how long does it take to implement business performance software?
So whether it's Excel or business intelligence tools, as an example, most tools that are out there typically are just looking at data, and that's all they are, right? They're looking at data. Excel is going to track, spreadsheets for you with your data, and you can add notes to it if you want to do that, as an example. Or you may have a separate tab that you can have corrective actions, and I've seen that in a lot of cases. When we look at a business performance management system, is we're looking at kind of a holistic tool that brings all the data together in one place that's visible and transparent to the company and to the users. It also allows for the alignment information, which a lot of times is more challenging. So I think what you find is, you use Excel as an example, you're going to have very high profile Excel users who understand how to do pivot tables and really use the intricacies of macros as an example in Excel. The problem is, whenever I've looked at a lot of these, number one, people move on from their roles and these files become dead or become inactive, right? The second is, a lot of times formulas that are out there are changed or managed differently or inconsistent or have errors in them out there, versus a business performance tool where you can have the confidence that when data is entered and managed in a tool, that the data is the data, right? It's going to be calculated properly, it's going to be displayed properly in the system. And then to the last part of that question about implementation, it depends on the organization. There's different tools. If you look at Visual as an example, it's a very simple implementation. It's not quick. We have people up and running in a couple of days. So it's not a SAP or an ERP type of implementation out there. The key is really getting into the process beforehand of getting the right metrics to be measured and the process established. The tool is a tool, right? The tool you can implement, it's that foundation component that really is critical to getting the tool to be effective for you.
All right, Paul, I think we have time for one more. That would be, how does this reduce the time spent in meetings?
Well, one word, I say focus, right? Is really the one piece that we find out there, because all the data, all the information can be in one place, and you're driving towards ideal behaviors that you're having a very focused conversation out there. That's really the key. And by having a focused conversation, all the extraneous information and sharing that goes on in these meetings, you take out of the way, you offload, right? So for example, if you've got a meeting and there's a rich dialogue that's going on, you're not trying to stop dialogue, but you know what? That should be taken offline in the conversation. Let's focus this discussion. And what we've seen is, by creating these standardized agendas that people follow, they have truly changed the dynamic of meeting time from 2 hours, 3 hours every week to 30 minutes to 45 minutes every week, because it's a very focused conversation with the same results.
All right, Paul, thank you for an outstanding presentation.
Great. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
As a reminder, the Foundation's Institute for Performance Excellence has more than 400 training and professional development certification opportunities. online, and at your own pace. This month, we are showcasing design thinking, creativity and innovation toolkit, and introduction to critical thinking. You can visit the Institute website at baldrigeinstitute.org/education to learn more and register. As a reminder, next week we will be sending out links to the recorded version of the webinar and links to the slides to everybody who is registered. So watch your inbox. And our next webinar is on May 23rd, where guest will be South Central Foundation. Thanks again to all our sponsors, especially the Mac Baldrige Society trustees who make this presentation possible. Thanks for attending and have a great afternoon.